Thank you for the introduction, and I appreciate your time. Getting a little late in the afternoon. Hopefully folks are hanging in there. Got a time to take some breaks. So this talk, not going to weave the two topics back and forth. They are going to be presented separately, but there is a common spirit to them both, and that is that commercial tools are fantastic. They can do amazing things, but sometimes DIY might be good enough. So that's the idea. So PowerShell scripting with Excel. I've got another quote. I'm quoting myself all day. It's never the most efficient option, but it's often the most convenient. This is for quick hits, for any number of things, and we'll jump into it. So the who am I slide. Yep, I'm on Mastodon. Come see me there. Career arc, because that's always interesting to talk about. I was in tuxedo sales in high school. A-10 mechanic doing weapons on those jets. Then I did event security while going to college, became a PC tech, infrastructure engineer, and now security ops. So when I say convenient, what makes this method convenient? A lot of tools and dashboards, and again, this is oriented for folks that are earlier in the career or freshly switched to this line of work. Most things will output as CSV files, and sometimes you get asked to do a mind-numbing repetitive task with those outputs or exports. Nice thing about integrating Excel is you can use all the fancy Excel features. You can examine results of a programmatic process that you've run in a pivot table right immediately after you finish. It can be a human readable output that you're ready to share as soon as you're done with your work. And a couple other reasons that are out there. So this, in 20 minutes, it's not intended to teach Excel or PowerShell. There's so many good teachers and courses and things like that are out there. This is just, if you've messed with both of these things, how can you use them together to do interesting new things? So I've got a few references linked there. I've also got them in that 2023 session resources Google Doc that's floating around. Thanks for that. So those are already up there. But the intent today is to take a shell of a script that you can integrate your own functions into to do some boring repetitive task in a programmatic way, and be on with it. So a little word of warning, kind of timely. So Wendy on Mastodon had tweeted an article about how the individual cannot stand where business processes are built around scripts. So it's worth calling out here that, if you're going to be doing an enduring process, you have to make sure it's supportable, right? So that second bullet there, business processes shouldn't be built around this capability unless there's a support plan with more than one person equipped to maintain it. So that is your word of warning. So how have I used this before? Many, many ways. Dozens and dozens of mini projects or subtasks to a large project that were able to be accomplished quickly by just mocking up a little PowerShell and pointing it at the input docs that I'm getting from the project team. So a couple examples: checking computer accounts at AD, making sure they're active or not, getting the files from a folder, generating the hashes, and creating just inventory in Excel, creating users, creating groups, and adding users to implement roles. So I did use this as a function to convert an organization to role-based access by programmatically checking to see if a group existed in Active Directory, and if not, create the group, set the attributes, add the users, so on and so forth, write down a huge list of 15,000 people. So we'll jump into the first example. First example, this is posted on the GitHub. That's shown down at the bottom of the screen. I'll post that link later as well, but we'll just run through it real quick. So you've got this PowerShell, this PS1 file. First thing we do is we specify the path to the executable, or the path to the source document that we're going to work from. And then comes the big part of this talk, which is creating Excel as an object that we can interact with in PowerShell. Now, you can do this with other Office applications too. And I'll touch on that a little bit later. I like to see Excel while this kind of thing is running. So I make it visible. That's one of the methods that you can employ here. From there, we get the spreadsheet declaration set up by having the application object open the path that we specified in the beginning. We'll activate the spreadsheet to make sure it has focus. And then we'll specify the worksheet, the first tab or page in the Excel file, in this case. The thing you want to look out for is off by one errors. There are some things that you're doing in PowerShell that are going to start numbering at 0, and some things when you're interacting with the application that'll start numbering at 1. For example, when you're talking about columns and rows in Excel, when you're interacting with them programmatically like this, the numbers are the rows and columns are both represented by numbers, and they both start with 1. So cell A1 is 1, 1 in the spreadsheet. Now, the majority of input files that I've dealt with in the past have had a header row. So we account for that by setting an integer for the starting row to be 2, so that the first entry that we're going to work on is in the second row. Now, all you do is you loop through, and at the end, on line 47 there, it says until the value equals null. So this will do something from Excel for each line until it encounters a blank line. So the way that this is written, if your first column has a gap in it, the script will stop processing at that gap. So that's something to be cognizant of. But this example is meant to be very basic. It starts with a test connection commandlet in PowerShell to ping a server, see if it's online. If it succeeds in this if statement, we set a variable to true, and then we call the worksheet object, and we tell it which cell we want to work with. So it's the current row in the loop in the first column. Change the color interior to 4. Color index is something that you would want to have a cheat sheet for. There are a number of references online. If you searched Excel color index right now, you would get a full list of numbers and associated colors. We get an else statement, color it red if it can't ping it. Then after the if else, we take the status variable, that true or false that we built as part of this if statement, and we write it out into Excel in the second cell. After that, we just increment the row number and go through it again until we come to a blank row. So that's the basic example. This is one of many color index color charts that are out there on the internet. I have a little note here that you can actually make what amounts to a status bar, essentially, by putting something at the beginning of your do loop to color the cell. I like to use yellow. And then even if I'm working with something with like 3,000 lines, I can zoom it out real far to the point that you can't read the content, but you can see the little yellow bar working its way down the screen. So getting into the more advanced stuff, again, this one isn't rocket science, but it's an evolution of that basic shell. Here, I found a neat function to get site collection members from SCCM. I was doing server patching where I had 400 to 500 Windows servers in a 4-hour window. We devised a strategy where we were applying the patches on the Friday before the weekend. And then Saturday morning, through group policy preferences, we had maintenance windows set up for 4 different groups or phases of servers. So what this script did is, if you look down on line 42, there's a populate sheet argument. So I've got this option built in where I can say, if I want to populate the sheet, if I'm starting validating patching activity first time of the day, I'll tell it that whether I'm doing production or QA. And then it'll go out using the function that I stole to contact SCCM and get the collection members for those collections. So once it builds that list, it gets through all that list construction and begins to do the work. So now I've got a wildcard switch statement in here to look at some of the responses when I start doing the programmatic work. So for each line that we've now populated this sheet, ping the server. Is it up? If it's up, great. Follow that up by extracting the domain name from the ping command, so we can just catalog that back into the sheet. I'm writing that back into row 3. Then moving down, if it's online, we're going to query it to see if it has a reboot pending. So when you apply patches to a Windows machine, you'll sometimes get a pop-up in the corner that says, hey, needs a reboot to complete updates. Now, when you're working in a server environment, if it's not managed particularly well, or you're running a really small team, there may be servers that get missed or incomplete. There may be a predecessor patch that wasn't installed before the current patch. So then once all our maintenance windows fire, then you end up in the situation where the machine gets additional updates installed after the maintenance window has expired for reboots. So we're checking to see, number one, did the server come up clean after we rebooted it? And number two, is there still a reboot pending, meaning are updates not complete? So running this script a second time, but if I tell it, I'm going to go back, populate sheet equals none, that means don't use that function to go get the SCCM collection members. We've already created this list of targets. So we will instead go back to the beginning of the list and recheck for status. Now, what does it do? So we did the ping check, we did the query to see if it's got a reboot pending, we build our result string, and then we write back out into the spreadsheet the current status of the server and the current time when we were at that point in the loop. So we're time stamping the output to say this was the status at this specific time. Then it was very easy to have a pivot table on another sheet with a list of the servers that didn't come up clean, or with the list of the servers that needed reboots. I could fire off an email, copy and paste right out of there to the support staff and tell them what machines needed to be rebooted or looked at. So essentially, we ended up with an output that looks something like this. It's redacted. It's kind of hard to see, and you wouldn't be able to see all the formula and things like that. But that column B is the results that came out. So reboot pending is false. The server name is in green for that first line, and it was checked. This was this sample that I pulled was from a long time ago. So we know that server's good. I use some VLOOKUP, clever stuff in Excel to determine which patch window it's scheduled for, which of the maintenance windows it's scheduled for. So if I run this at 9 a.m. and I see the server's not up yet, I know there's a problem because it should have been done at 8:45. So high level, that's basically how that works. I've got both of the example scripts there sitting in a GitHub that I set up a long time ago. I threw them out there. I'll put the link out there for that. And then, yeah, it'd be interesting to see what you come up with. So some pancakes for thought. I did mention it supports things like Outlook and other Office tools. You can pull a list of email addresses from Excel into an array, create a message in Outlook. So I once did a script on a Hack5 rubber ducky to interact with Office objects around the office. So if somebody left their machine unattended and unlocked, and I had a good working relationship with them, that's the important part. I'd stick it into their machine and it would open Outlook and send an email to the security team offering to buy lunch in exchange for some refresher training. And then it locked the PC for them. It only took a few seconds to execute. But the key takeaway there was the script would call Outlook as installed on their machine, and the email would come from them. I wasn't having to rely on open relays or anything. It came directly from their mailbox. So that's fun. Use with caution. So I can do questions now on that, or we can save them to the end. I'm flexible. Otherwise, I'll move on.
Let's go ahead and do them at the end. Thank you.
All right, great. All right. So again, the spirit of DIY, there are, $700 ice makers that will create beautiful, clear ice in great volume for your parties and things like that. But, there are a few DIY solutions that are pretty solid as well. There are plenty of pitfalls and ways that you can get a substandard result. So the intent here is to explain the mistakes that I made so you can skip that part. So this all relies on a concept called directional freezing. I stole some of this language. I don't have citations in here. I ran out of time, but I stole it. So, confession made. Simple method by controlling the direction water freezes. So the picture on the right, I tried to illustrate this. I dyed some water with food coloring and use this method. And then I let it go way too long in the vessel and pulled it out. But you can see that the color was pushed out of the initial area where the freeze started. That's presented upside down out of the vessel. So you can run into a few bugs. And like I said, I'd like to call those out for you. So let's say you did everything perfect and you get this beautiful block or sphere or cube or whatever. You put it in your drink, you do a pour over, and it cracks or shatters right down the middle. So this is typically due to the fact that most home freezers are set well below freezing. And the best way to sort of avoid this is to pull the ice out and let it come up to temp a little bit on the counter for 5 minutes. You can put it in a clean bowl, give it some time. It'll have a clear, wet surface. Then you know it's ready. So another thing that you can run into is dissolved solids. So this is, if you've got heavy water or hard water, rather, not heavy water. You shouldn't be making ice out of heavy water. That's a whole other thing. If you've got hard water or lots of dissolved solids, then you'll get artifacts when it freezes. You'll also get streaking if the water is exceptionally pure. So some people have zero water filters that will get the total dissolved solids down to nothing. The problem with that is it streaks from freezing too fast because you don't have enough dissolved solids. So when you're working with exceptionally pure water, it's good to put a little splash of known safe tap water in there, just so the ice can freeze in the way it's supposed to. So for my example, I have a relatively inexpensive mainstream total dissolved solids tester. I don't know if you'll be able to see that, but we'll see. And I did a little testing. So the way that I have my house set up, I'm on well water out in the middle of nowhere. The water softened hot water that goes through a whole house filter is about 430 ppm, parts per million of total dissolved solids. And then the cold filtered water, I have a secondary small filter at my sink. And it's about 217. So it does a pretty decent job of cutting it down. It doesn't taste perfect, but it's fine, When I melted some of the clear ice when using the directional freezing technique that came out of the cold filtered tap, it was only 50 ppm. So a little additional clarification there. So this is not a water refinement method. If the water is not potable to start, you shouldn't use directional freezing as a purification method. Just getting that out there. But the upside is if it doesn't taste perfect and it comes out better. For example, I tested some bottled water and it was around 45 ppm because of the added electrolytes or whatever they're saying these days. The last major bug with directional freezing is dissolved gases. This isn't usually a problem unless the water's smelly, right? So if you've got a sulfury smell from your well, which you can get in certain areas, then you may run into some problems. You can boil it to evaporate off some of the water that's dissolved. But at that point, it's starting to be kind of a pain, and you might want to consider an alternate source. So vessels on the cheap. You can buy fancy molds. There are a number of good ones out there. Usually they're low volume. You can make 2 spheres once every 2 days. It costs $80 or something like that. So some things you may have laying around: insulated tumblers, vendor swag for many years. I wound up with a bunch of them. They're good if you have a small freezer and not a ton of space. Downside is the shapes that come out of them may not match your favorite glass. So you may have to either shape them down with water or shaving or any number of other techniques. And the tumbler shape is really important. A lot of them have a slight taper to them. So if it tapers down as it gets closer to the neck, it's going to be very difficult to get the ice out. You're going to have to end up melting quite a bit of it to get it through the smaller opening. Best thing for volume is a small cooler. So that's that one there. And what I use in some of these demos is a 6-can igloo cooler. Nice side effect is if you've been thinking about trying sous vide, they're also really good vessels for that. Because your electric heater element in your sous vide won't have to run as hard if it's in an insulated container. You do have to shape it. So bread knife to cut the ice or an ice knife for cutting and chipping. And then there's also improvised vessels. Let's say you have neither of those things. If you have a glass that's not a glass. If you have a vessel that is made of food safe metal, like a shaker, like a cocktail shaker, or food safe plastic that can go in the freezer, you can insulate the exterior. There's a number of ways you can do that. You can use packing material like meal kits and things like that will come with different types of foams. You could figure something out. As long as you understand the concept that you're trying to make the water freeze in a directional manner by insulating the sides and leaving the top open. So this picture is a result of last week. I did a fresh batch and threw a photo up on Mastodon. So what you do is you start with cleaning the cooler. Make sure it's clean, please. Remove the lid. Unless you have the space in your freezer to leave the lid on, you can do that. And for reference, these coolers are usually around $20. You may already have one. So not buying the $80 ice mold to make 2 spheres at a time. So you fill it about 2/3 of the way and throw it in the freezer. For me, 24 hours. You may have to leave it a little longer or a little shorter. You'll just have to experiment a bit and figure out how your freezer works. From there, after 24 hours, this is what it looked like when it came out. You clean the sink and wash your hands, of course, because we're doing food handling procedures here. Clean cutting board in the bottom of the sink is your best bet. Towel, if you don't have one, that's a little messier. And then you just flip the cooler over, and there should be a bunch of unfrozen water underneath. And that's the goal. That will be weighing down on that big block of ice. A couple of taps on the bottom of the cooler comes down with a thunk. After that, you just knock the loose bits off from where it froze around the periphery. And if you like, you can generally plane this down and flatten the bottom of this block by running warm water slowly over the cutting board as you slide it in a circular motion, almost like the inverse of an orbital sander, right? We're taking the medium that we're working with and we're sanding it against a stationary item. So if you want, roughly 4-inch cubes, then you just cut it into 3 strips. And then from there, you cut each strip in half. When you're cutting, you don't have to push down hard on the knife. You let the tool do the work. You want to hold it as perpendicular as possible because the break is going to happen in the direction of your cut. And then you saw back and forth, and you don't have to go deep. A ½ inch, even a quarter is usually sufficient. That's about 10 millimeters to folks that use the superior system. So when it comes time to split, you want to hold the knife firmly in one hand, not pushing down hard, just holding it vertically firmly, and then tap the back of the knife. I use a wooden spoon. It's the safest thing that I can use, and it's a light tap. If you're beating on the knife, you're either not making good contact or you're doing something else wrong. This should be really low drama. And then finally, you cut each of those strips in half to get 6 large cubes. So you can store these cubes once you've made them in a freezer bag. That won't keep them from frosting over. You'll still get a light layer of frost. But since you have to let them acclimate to room temperature when you take them out, otherwise they'll crack anyway, doesn't really matter. That frost disappears when sitting out for 5 minutes. Alternatively, you can do a couple different shapes. So if you do 3 strips, you're going to get roughly 6 4-inch cubes out of this particular cooler. But you can start with 4 strips if you want to make a long ice tower for like a highball glass. So moving on to tumblers, the extraction can take a while. So after you've frozen properly, you invert it on the center rib of a split sink. If you can do that, some of them are rounded, you can't do that. Some of them are single sinks, you can't do that. So you just, put a cutting board in there. You just wait for it to fall naturally. It takes about an hour, and it will slowly melt up the sides to decrease the diameter of the cylinder that you've created. After about an hour, it's pretty easy to shim down the side. If you have lockpicks and you've got a clean lockpick that you can make food safe, I'm not necessarily recommending that as an option, but if you can get something down the side of the vessel safely, you can break the seal just enough to let air get up underneath the ice, and then it'll fall out easily. Otherwise, you just wait a little longer. So let's say you accounted for those main bugs that we talked about and it still didn't come out quite right. What are some of the other things that could be a factor? So if you didn't have enough water, let's say your total dissolved solids count is really high and you didn't have enough water in your vessel, so there isn't enough room for those impurities to be pushed, then you'll get a lot of hazing in a very small section of clear ice. If you let it go too long in the freezer, to the point that it can get the tendrils all the way to the bottom and start coming back up to the top, that cloudiness will propagate back up into the ice cylinder you've made. Or if the freezer is just too cold or has a rapid freeze function, you're going to need a larger vessel with more water to create enough of a thermal load that it will freeze slowly enough. So this is what good looks like. That one in the center is a very large mug. It's like a 32-ounce tumbler. That bubble that you see is about 4.5 inches down in that tumbler, and that was after 16 hours in the freezer. So if you see a little air bubble underneath and you spin it around, and when you move it around, that means you still have water underneath the ice layer, and you're in good shape. The only thing you're really looking for there is if that bubble is deep enough that you're getting a block the size you want, whether or not it's done. So yeah, if you let it go too long, you get the picture on the left. You get that cloudiness that comes back up the vessel. That's inverted from one of the smaller cups. The one on the right is that 4.5 inch thick chunk. The only reason it's not perfectly clear when looking through at the logo on that carving knife is because I didn't plane the faces flat. If I had, you'd hardly see anything on the picture because you'd be looking straight through it. So some things to think about. If you made your blocks a little oversized and they don't fit in the glass, you can run water slowly over the corners to sort of shave them down effectively. And then again, you can use cutting boards for planing the ice. They usually have a little bit of texture to them, so they work pretty good for that. So I ran through that super quick, anticipating questions about the code stuff. So do we have any questions in the chat?
We had one question so far, which is, have you ever used Doug Finke's import Excel module?
I have not. I've never looked at that. I started using this methodology with VB script in 2005 or 6, something like that. And it continued to work for me for many years. I only switched to PowerShell to get with the times. VB script still works today, provided the dependencies are met, but I'll definitely look into that. I'll look into the module. Either way, the concept has been immensely useful. Lots and lots of examples over the years.
Awesome. Do we have any other questions? Please drop them in Slack. At this point, we don't have any more. So if you had anything else that you wanted to throw in at the end, that is amazing.
Don't do that, Dave.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the chat now.
Yeah. Why buy a vulnerability scanner license when you can slowly descend into madness developing your own vulnerability scanner in PowerShell and Excel?
Right. Yeah, don't do that.
Don't do that. All right, then. Well, I will just ask you to keep an eye on Slack. And if you have any closing words, this would be a perfect time for them.
Yeah. Again, just calling out that warning, don't build a critical business function around this unless you've got at least 2 people that can support it. So that's definitely words of wisdom there. The other thing is having the row highlighting is useful when you are, it's an alternate method for debugging. So if you've done breakpoints in the past or echo statements or whatever, anytime that you're reading from Excel or writing to Excel, you can highlight the cell a specific color, and then you can very quickly see where the data might be imperfect or maybe an input validation thing that you failed to accommodate for. That's makes it debugging super easy if you're constantly writing out where it's doing the work in your output form. So that's a good tip. And let's see. Where else have I had issues? A lot of the key concepts about this are what's illustrated in those 2 scripts. But like I said, you can do a lot more. Feel free to reach out to me on Mastodon if you're messing with this or you're just trying to figure out how to make this work and you're at a point where you're not sure. It'll be frustrating to try and look back at forums from 15 years ago on the internet for something like this. So, feel free to reach out.